All right, so let's first talk about audiences. And Linda, in your experience going out there into the field, first off, how can you identify someone who is actually open to this discussion at all?
I mean, it depends on the situation, but usually it's pretty self-evident. Most of the time, if I meet someone at an event or something like that, and I tell them about what I do with the Illinois Business Immigration Coalition, their entire face will change, their eyes will light up, they'll get wide, they'll show visual signs that they're interested, and a lot of times they will start to share their own experiences with immigration, especially if there's someone who's in business. They'll say something like, oh my gosh, yes, I know, I have such a hard time recruiting American workers. This impacts me. When it's on the phone, if I just call someone up, a lot of times what I'm asking from them is that they will take, 30 to 45 minutes of their time to meet with me at a later date, so I can learn more about how they are impacted. And business owners are usually going to be pretty upfront with you if they do not want to give you 30 to 45 minutes of their time. So it's pretty self-evident, in my opinion. The only thing I can say is that sometimes you'll get people who you can tell are being polite. And they'll say, oh yes, send me some information, give me your business card, but then they don't answer your calls. So it's pretty obvious.
And one thing I learned from the webinar we did on immigration and national security was Alex Norosta from the Cato Institute is very much okay using the term illegal immigrants. And he explained that when he talks to conservative groups, he can't go there and start off with talking about undocumented immigrants. People shut down. And I don't know if, Andrew, you have experience sort of modifying your messages depending on what kind of audience you're talking to.
Definitely. And just to give you some background, so NAE, New American Economy, started as an initiative out of City Hall in New York, but it was from the beginning a partnership of mayors and business leaders from across the country who were looking to make the economic case for immigration reform. And so it started off as it's a bipartisan group, and so we sort of had to forge a middle way between sort of arguments on the left about morality and human rights, then arguments from the right which were about security and borders and things like that. And so through our entire history, we've really had to be really flexible depending on the audience that we work with. And so for example, our Gateways for Growth program, which we launched in partnership with Welcoming America, we work with cities around the country who are looking for research and technical support to support welcoming initiatives at the local level. And so our main argument, our main frame there is that welcoming immigrants into your community really allows them to fulfill their potential, and that really benefits everyone in your town or city because it creates a strong community, it creates more economic activity, which has repercussions for the entire economy as a whole.
But Marissa, I know that you had some issues with Alex Norosta's assertion. I mean, are there some pitfalls that we are just really susceptible to doing, especially when we try to modify our messages? Are we, by saying illegal immigrants, even if that's what the audience is receptive to, are we just reinforcing the things that we don't want to reinforce?
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. I think I understand that. I understand Alex's justification for using the term illegal immigrants with certain audiences, but every time you say it, you're just reinforcing in their minds that particular framing of people who are undocumented. So I think if you say that and then try and make an argument for why they should get a pathway to citizenship, you've potentially sort of already shot yourself in the foot in terms of making a good argument. So it would be better to perhaps start with more of a moral argument and then talk about undocumented people. So cueing the more productive ways of thinking first, and then using a term that maybe people are less comfortable with, but might understand better, be more accepting of if they've already heard this frame that cues their better ways of thinking about the topic.
And moving now into the content of our messages, Linda and David, and I'll get to you, Andrew, afterwards about your Map the Impact project. We have the data, we have certain framing, we have certain language. In making that argument, that compelling argument, how do you sort of package or layer your messages? Linda?
So there's two things. One, I think it's important that you always contextualize data. So it's one thing if I talk about, that the Farm Bureau estimates that between 50 and 70% of their workforce is undocumented. It's another thing if I tell you that I know a small farm owner, out in McHenry County, Illinois, who tells me that, she and her husband, who have run this farm for 50 years, have not had an American worker try to apply to work with them for over 2 years. And that it is virtually impossible for them to hire Americans as much as they are trying to. So providing a real face for that data, like a real person who is impacted by it, and how that data plays out in real life is really important. The other thing I think is really important as well is also, combining it with, as Marisa pointed out, with the idea of values. Kind of creating that narrative. So like talking about immigrants in a framework of, people who are really hardworking, people who want to provide for their families. And those are definitely values that I think most Americans can agree with and understand.
David?
I'd say, yeah, for us, it depends whether we're talking directly to an audience or talking to the media. In talking directly to an audience or on a talk show, I think we do try to have something like the narrative arc that Marissa's talking about and, spice it up with some, like Linda's talking about, some particular people we might have met or stories we know about. I think we also really try to help people to understand the story about immigrants and what's going on in the American economy, which I would say is maybe not always exactly the same thing as convincing them, but we think it's important in the long run, not just that they kind of move their dial, but also that they actually understand what's happening. For reporters, I would say, especially print reporters or a television journalist that's doing something where they're going to do some, going out into the street, I think it's our value added at the Fiscal Policy Institute is the data. And so that is kind of what they want from us is, can we give them a few data points? Can they tell us something, an interesting research result that they can build a story around? When we did our Main Street business report, for example, it was great to talk to the reporters about, different lists of what kind of business owners from what places could we tell them about, where would they expect to find them, and exciting for us to hear the reporters then, get enthusiastic. There was a reporter from Minneapolis who went out and said it was her most favorite story she ever reported on because she thought it was going to be hard maybe to find immigrant business owners, and she just walked down the street and started knocking on doors of people in the kinds of businesses we were talking about, and she said it was easy to find them.
Andrew, the Map the Impact project sort of, I call it, and you can tell me what you call it, with layers information. It's the data, it's stories, it's social media. Tell us a little bit, very, very briefly about it, what it's like. We're going to share the link in the chat box, and then how local constituencies can really use this or adapt it to their own needs.
Yeah, and so Map the Impact, it's an interactive tool that we've created last year, and it integrates data from various sources, the US Census and other government sources from like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis, et cetera. And the point of it was really to make the data as accessible and as relevant to people around the country as possible. And so, while it's obvious that you'll have national level data and state level data there, we really wanted even more layers or geographical areas that people could look at that were more relevant to them. So we also have data for metro areas, for the largest 100 metro areas in the country. And we also have data on every congressional district in the country as well. And the idea there is, as I said, to make it really speak to people's experiences that they are actually in, whether it's their city or their town, or if they're more politically minded, who their representative really is representing. And the hope is that it's a tool for advocates, obviously, but also policymakers who are interested in the communities that they serve, but also the press. And part of the reasons that we included stories in the map is, as you've been hearing, it really is helpful to put a human face on all these numbers. And when we get a request from the press, we are able to tell them, we have collected these stories in the area that you're interested in. If you're interested in entrepreneurship, if you're interested in technology, in undocumented immigrants, we have all these stories that we can basically provide you a contact with, and just makes it easier for them to cover the issue and to have the data on hand and to weave it into their stories to the general public.
And now, Marissa, you spoke about contextualizing things, and we saw in the video a little bit of what I'm about to ask next. I think, and maybe I'm overstating this, but there is a certain sense of not just this, we're up against this powerful anti-immigrant narrative, but that is buttressed by feelings of economic and racial disenfranchisement, I would say, among some US-born Americans. Is there even a way for us to begin to counter this in order for US-born Americans to just at least recognize and appreciate immigrant contributions to their own well-being?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as I noted in the swamp, and you didn't see it quite as much in the video, people, when you talk about them on a deep level about how they feel about immigration, that people are people, sort of us thinking is there. And it might be a little more recessive for certain groups of people. It might be a little more back of mind as opposed to the very first thing that they think of. But it's there and people have access to it. The important thing for all of us as communicators is to make sure that that sort of, we're all human beings thinking is the thing that we're cueing when we talk or when we write something down. That my grandparents came from Ireland, or my great-grandparents were, or even my parents were immigrants as well. Those types of really productive cultural models are there for everybody who lives in the United States. They might be buried a little bit deeply, but the important thing is to understand that it's there and that you can cue it, and not to start off with something that's going to make people think about, oh, those folks are going to take our jobs. It's, oh, those folks are my neighbors. They're part of my community. They're the parents of the children that go to school with my children. So thinking about how you can tell those types of stories is the way to go.
I think if I could add also,
and David,
oh, can I jump in on that? I would say, I think we know what it looks like and people understand what it looks like when an economy is growing. And it's not that there's a big restriction on the labor supply. It's that, that there are lots of jobs, that there's just stuff happening, there's a lot of activity. And, I think that different people can fit into that kind of a picture of growth in different ways. So I think, how do you make sure that you're talking about them, providing on-ramps into it, so it doesn't feel exclusionary, but like there is overall growth, because we also know what it looks like when an economy is not growing in a lot of the parts of this country where you don't see immigration and don't see economic growth. It's not a good picture for the US-born people there.
And Linda, in your interactions, I imagine that you have experienced some resistance. Perhaps there are ways and tips of, based on what Marissa said, of just sort of opening the door to those conversations.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that I've learned over time is that you always have to consider the other person's own story and self-interest. What is the context to which you are, or they are coming to you? I think anecdotally everyone has like that one family member at Thanksgiving that they can't really talk to about immigration or politics. And I definitely have one of those. And, for years I avoided the subject with him. And one day it just came up at the dinner table, and he's very hostile to immigration and immigrants overall. But he's also a business owner. He owns, multiple businesses in his city. And when I started to talk about immigration in terms of, well, there are a lot of industries and companies that cannot recruit American-born workers. Americans just don't apply for these jobs. If they do, they stay for, maybe a week or two and then they quit. And suddenly this family member's face just completely changed. And, he said, oh my gosh, like I have the worst problem with that. Like people don't want to work hard. Like they just like, they stay for a couple months and then they leave, and I can't run a business like that. And so suddenly this person who, had never been open to talking about immigration or considering another perspective kind of got it for a little bit, or at least in this sense. So I think keeping in mind, what are the things that people are at their core concerned about? What are they worried about? What are they thinking about? And how does that feed into their perception of immigration and immigrants?
I just want us to address two quick points before going to questions from our attendees, which are coming in fast and furious. Everyone is doing storytelling. Everyone is putting out stories about dreamers and TPS recipients, and I don't see that they're all efficacious, that they're all having the intended effect. And I'm wondering, Marissa, if you could just give us a few little tips on how we should go about storytelling. And I know you talk about putting it within a wider narrative, of looking at the system, right?
Yeah. So we here at Frameworks always recommend that if you're going to tell an individual story, you have to make it part of a larger thematic or contextual story. You have to talk about systems, you have to talk about the ways in which people are embedded in communities. You can't just focus on that individual, because what happens otherwise is people identify with that individual and think, well, that person deserves to stay in the United States, but they don't actually then think, well, everybody in that group deserves to stay in the United States. They just identify with that one person, you know, and this is the pitfall of empathy. You can really only have empathy with one person at a time. So we always want people to use these as opportunities to tell a bigger story so that people will understand the conditions in which that particular individual ended up in this situation, so that then they can spread out their empathy or their interest to other people that are facing the same conditions. So that is context, context, context. Always give the context.
And a last point before we go to questions from the audience, you spoke about sustaining messages over time. So we are faced with this anti-immigrant narrative, this restrictionist narrative, where it's embedded in our psyche. They take our jobs, they live off welfare, they're dangerous people. That has been a sustained message over many, many, many years. So in order for us to combat this narrative, we not only have to generate more messages ourselves, we have to get other people to generate those messages too. Yeah. So perhaps David and Andrew, in your experiences, who are some of the allies that we can get on board with these messages that perhaps immigrant and refugee serving organizations aren't really on their radar? Well,
I'll say, I mean, there's so many. I think teachers, nurses, librarians, but maybe an important one that I'm sure Andrew will also chime in on is going to sound obvious, but I think business leaders, and I would also say labor unions. I mean, we've been working with the Chamber of Commerce in Syracuse, for example, and having them be part of a discussion, especially when it's part of a discussion that's not about their normal topics. So for example, discussion about refugee resettlement really gets the attention of public officials and can also help to convince the general public that, yeah, maybe refugees are actually part of an economic revitalization of the city, rather than just thinking about it as, you know, the way people normally might think about refugees. Getting labor unions on board should seem even more obvious, but sometimes advocates are wary, I know. I mean, unions will sometimes be on your side if you're advocating for immigration, but sometimes not. Unions are not all the same. It's important to recognize the differences among them, so to have some understanding of who you're talking to and, you know, who you might approach for things. And then, you know, look for the opportunities for where you can be together, you know, just as you would with the business leaders. I think it's worth it, because they have some real clout in politics and with their members.
Completely, and I completely agree with what David said. And, you know, I mentioned our Gateways for Growth initiative, and I would say in more than half of the partnerships that we have with cities across the country, one of the local partners is almost always a Chamber of Commerce or a business association. And those people on the ground are really, you know, experiencing day to day the struggles that their local businesses are having, perhaps with workforce or hiring or finding talent that meets their needs. But they also know that, you know, having a busy main street or having foot traffic that are going down economic corridors is important. And, you know, in a place like Akron, Ohio, or a lot of cities that we work with in the Midwest that have experienced depopulation, the narrative of immigrants really, you know, coming to a place, bringing back neighborhoods, main streets back to life is really something that resonates really strongly with them. And so I mentioned Akron. We did a report on Akron, and Akron has a very sizable refugee population. And we were able to tell the story of a neighborhood in Akron, North Hill, that had for decades really been sort of run down, abandoned, not a lot of economic activity. And suddenly, or over the course of a couple of years, Bhutanese refugees and other immigrants from South Asia came in and really brought life back into this neighborhood, you know, opened stores up on the main streets. And it was something that people on the ground who may not have been otherwise open to that sort of argument or discussion about immigration in a positive light really recognized it and saw it as something that they could, you know, vouch for themselves.
So I'm going to tell you now, we're going to go a few minutes over 2 o'clock. but I want to get to just a few questions, really specific questions. And this is one comes from Betty in Pittsburgh. And she wants a real tangible example of using that moral argument, that sort of frame. You know, Marissa sees it as an effective opener. Do you have recommendations of what kind of values would you start your conversations with? What values are, you know, give a specific situation. Let's say you're talking to a business leader, or you're talking to a chamber, or you're talking to a farmer. Maybe give us a scenario.
So I think in every case, you can talk about our shared values as Americans, and our shared value as American is that we respect the dignity of all people and we believe in compassion, right? So when you're tearing parents away from their children because of circumstances that were beyond their control, that's not who we are as Americans. You know, whenever you see Donald Trump or somebody from the administration talk about we've got to get rid of these criminals, and then stripping away work authorization from people who have been in this country for 25 years on TPS, who were never given any possibility of a pathway to citizenship, that is immoral. And I think you can assert that and talk about the ways that in which we have shared American values that really this goes against. So.
And I want to just keep it with you, Marissa, and we spoke about this a year ago. How do you counter those false claims about immigrants committing crimes or taking jobs without triggering those negative frames? I imagine we just don't want to admit, right?
Yeah, so don't repeat it. Don't ever repeat the myth. You know, if you can avoid it, you can refute these things without actually repeating them. And if you have to repeat them, they always need to come second. So you say, you know, immigrants to this country commit fewer crimes than native-born Americans. They're incarcerated at lower rates. That's a fact. I would say, you know, ideally you would want to frame it with more context. But then if you have to repeat the thing that you're refuting, make that be the second thing that you say, not the first thing that you say. That's the most common mistake that I see is, Jeff Sessions said this, but it's not true. No, assert the truth, and then you can note that Jeff Sessions said something that was not. So.
And we have some other questions here about the narrative. So Sarah had sent us several questions, and one of them is about empowering immigrants to be able to speak for themselves and to tell their stories, giving them the opportunities to do it for themselves, in addition to what the rest of us are doing. Are there any tips that we have in terms of immigrants going out there? You know, we see in churches might have a family come up on the pulpit and tell their stories. What are some of the things they can do, and probably what are some of the things that they should avoid? I know that you work with the Evangelical Shared Table. Linda, perhaps you want to maybe give us some tips?
Sure. So I think one thing is exactly what you pointed out, which is that it's really important that we provide venues for, you know, actual immigrants to tell their stories. One way is to partner with churches, especially if it's someone who's a member of that particular church's congregation. In my own work with the Illinois Business Immigration Coalition, we also actively seek out immigrant business owners. And we try to provide ways for them to be able to, for example, meet with their own member of Congress and tell their story, because that also runs counter to a lot of the negative narratives that you have. The other thing I would say is that there's always strength in numbers. A lot of times you find that, at least I did when I worked with the Evangelical Immigration Table, there are a lot of immigrants who are scared to come forward with their stories if they were undocumented. But showing them that they are not standing alone. So, you know, maybe if they're sharing their story with another immigrant family, or, you know, standing with a different group or with their church or with a company or something like that, just showing people that they are not the only person who is speaking out on something really goes a long way towards giving them courage to continue to do it.
And this is a really pointed question, and it goes to the fact that a lot of the people who are anti-immigrant are those who live in areas without immigrants. And so, David, you spoke very, very pointedly about these cities that did not experience growth. So Kip wants to know, how might we put a story around the data that cities without immigrants are cities that didn't grow and prosper. And perhaps, Marissa, you can offer some feedback too. How do you sell that narrative in those kinds of places?
In those kind of places, yeah. So I mean, I think that is it's in some ways relatively easy often to engage people around the idea that the challenges of places like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit are about how do they regrow their population, right? Start without immigrants at all. That's I think a central thing that every economic development person in those places knows, is that they need to have bigger populations. So look at what have the population trends been in those places? In almost every case, what you see is that the one place where there's growth is among immigrants. And so, you know, any economist will tell you it's easier to pull on a string than to push on a string. You know, if what you see growing is the immigrant population, it's a good idea to figure out how do you make sure that the people who are coming are in fact, you know, succeeding, doing better, and drawing in other both immigrant and non-immigrants to the areas. And I think you can also do a little bit of what Andrew was saying, right? Is I mean, Akron fits that story pretty well. Is point to a neighborhood. You know, there's almost always one neighborhood that's grown, at least. And it's grown because there was an empty store, you know, there was a whole row of empty storefronts, and one person moved in and started a restaurant. And then as that happened, you know, after it started to get a little bit nicer, there was another restaurant next door, and maybe a grocery store, and maybe a retail shop. Well, a very high percentage of those people are likely to be immigrants who did that. And I think that's something people can kind of see. And also see that it's something that's good for the city. It's good for the tax base. It's good for the neighborhoods around it. It's good for property values. It's not just that these are immigrants doing it. It's also good for the overall population.
And I would just quickly add that, you know, I think around immigration and for a lot of different causes, people think that you have to tell an individual story. A place can be the protagonist of your story. And actually that's how you can create so much context. So the David mentioned Akron and what, Andrew mentioned Akron and what David just said. There's a great video from the BBC called The Missing about a small town in Washington, where the focus is not on the immigrants who left. In fact, they don't even appear in the video. It's about the people that they left behind in this place, which is now they can't hire workers because so many immigrants have left. You know, the soccer team is missing its soccer star, et cetera. So I just thought that was a great example of how you tell these stories about places, not just the individuals living in them.
And final couple of questions. We're talking a lot about words and framing. Everything now is visual. It's online, it's social media, it's photos, it's infographics. And so Stephanie was wondering on the kinds of images or photographs that are helpful in talking about immigration. And this is a very interesting question. You know, we've spoken previously in other webinars about how the empathetic frame tends actually not to work, but are there kinds of images that you think we can use in our you know, Eventbrite or on a Facebook, on Twitter, that you think would have a more positive, constructive effect on the audience? Does anyone have experience with this?
So I will just say briefly, we haven't done this specifically for immigration, but we have tested some stuff on homelessness, for instance, and there's been a fair amount written recently about framing with images, and that creating pity is actually not a very good way to create a sense of efficacy and a sense that things can actually be done. Plus, again, as I said, you can only empathize with one person at a time. So somebody might look with pity on that one person or that one family that's being kicked out of the country, but then they won't extend it out. So I think we have to think very and be really smart about alternatives that will give people a sense that A, this isn't just happening to one person, and that this is a system that's creating these circumstances for a lot of people, for all Americans, really. But also using images that don't make people just feel sort of beaten down and fatalistic about the opportunity for change. They have to be more positive than that.
Andrew, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so, you know, at NAE, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is a complete redesign and rebrand of all of our, you know, all of our research products and all of our social media content. And there was a real focus on creating graphics, especially data visualization, that was easy to understand and that gave a very positive outlook on all the economic contributions of immigrants, to show scale, to put it into context, but also, and for, as we were mentioning, storytelling and profiles, we include a photo with every profile that we feature in the report so that people can connect an image with the data and the story. And then one of the things I also wanted to mention is perhaps not as visual, but in a lot of the reports that we do, especially in the Midwest, where there are a lot of sensitivities around perhaps focusing only on how great the immigrant population is, we also really made an effort to interview US-born people in the communities that they themselves could tell their story and how they benefited from having more immigrants in their town, and also had a picture of them in their place of work, just kind of showing, these are real people, these are quote unquote real Americans, and they saw for themselves, the benefits of immigration.
And I think that speaks to one of another question we got about this idea that immigrants aren't sort of culturally compatible. You have all this Sharia law in Michigan, and getting the stories of Americans, an easily American business owner who hires immigrants and showing how hard they work and how they're friends and they have these relationships. I think that is very, very crucial. So last question before we wrap up. I want each of you just for 10 seconds to give one thing that attendees can, one actionable item that attendees can do right now after they close this webinar. And perhaps, David, we can start with you.
Gosh, I don't know. I wasn't ready for that. Actionable items, call your congressperson. No, I don't know. Look at some of the great videos people are sending up, or look at one of our reports. We've got a bunch of good ones, I think. That's probably 10 seconds. I don't know what's a quick actionable item.
Andrew?
Sure. I mean, this is kind of a plug. Go to maptheimpact.org. Play around with the map. Even explore areas that aren't your own hometown. Maybe, if you moved, from somewhere else, look at that place. But really try and explore. Maybe you'll realize, one of the great things that we found out while doing this map was how many different sectors are, immigration is such a broad topic that everything in the country really can be tied to immigration, and we try to reflect that in the data and the information that's in the map. So I invite you to explore it.
One thing that attendees can do to change the conversation, Linda?
So, I will tell you that you should call your members of Congress, especially right now, because of everything that's happening with the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program and finding a legislative solution to that. You can help, change maybe the narrative happening within a congressional office by calling them up and telling them how important it is to you to find a legislative solution for, the nearly 800,000 young undocumented immigrants who were brought here as kids, who have been living here and working here. I know that's more than 10 seconds, but it's really important.
Marissa?
So I would say write an op-ed for your local newspaper that's really well framed. I think we have some examples on our website of stuff that you can write, or just use your creative imagination based on what I talked about today and get your voice heard.